Welcome. Welcome to yet another video on Java interview series. Today we are going to discuss about the Tech Mahindra interview. The experience level is around 2 to 8 years, and this is one of the first round. The candidate got selected, and also he has got 17 LPA package. This video is about core Java, Spring Boot, Microservices interview questions, which are asked in the real interview questions. So the very first basic question was asked about what tell me about yourself. So you need to inform about what is your education, and also what is your experience, and also what you need to give with the confidence with the answer, right? So make sure you are well prepared for this. Also, the following question is always asked about, like, what explain your project architecture, what is your internal team structure, and also how the requirement was getting flowed to you, and the deliverables was delivered to the client. Now, what is composition and aggregation? Now, this is one of the core principles, or I would say one of the important oops principles. If you see, not exactly the oops principles, but actually this is one of the important core concepts when it comes to object oriented, and also when you're dealing with objects. Okay, so these both the types, whatever it is, so composition and aggregation, they both are type of the associations. Okay, that will some in a way will represent between the relation between the objects basically. Now this concept will describe how these objects can be related to each other, right? And how to manage their life cycle basically. So we will discuss first about the composition, so which is called as an has a relationship, so which represents something like a very strong relationship, which means the other object will not be able to exist without it, right? So so that's the reason it has gotten has a relationship. So one object owns the another object, and as I mentioned, one object cannot exist without the parent object. So one is a parent object and the child object. The child object cannot exist without the parent object. So if you see engine, and then we have a car, right? So if you see, car has got an engine as a part of it. Without car, actually there will be no engine, right? So you cannot exist that. That is how the composition is about aggregation. So it is kind of an with a loosely coupled relationship. But if you see aggregation, right, it's a weaker relationship. It is not as strong as the composition. Uh, the one object in this, there is a difference where it says that one object can definitely exist without the other object. So, but they both are independent, like the parent and the child object, they both are definitely independent, right? So that is how it should be. Like if you see the department and employee, the both, there can be many department, there can be many employees, right? So it cannot be like, if there is a department, then only there can be an employee, right? So there can be independently an employee exist. Okay. um, what are the object methods, and can you name them please? So this is one of the important questions, and also very core questions which is asked, and basically to test your knowledge on you are well aware of the core classes, which is the superclass of all the classes of the objects which you create. So these are the methods which are going to be available for every Java classes or the object, because it is indirectly or implicitly we are going to extend from the object class, which is going to inherit all the object methods, right? So it is one of the root class actually. So the very first thing is toString. Now if you see this, this is one of the important method, and it is going to represent the object details. So by default it will going to represent the object class name and its memory address basically. But uh, to have it more meaningful, or to have it customized, you can override it, and then you can have your own implementation. So this is how we have this particular toString method. Then second one is equals object. Now this is basically used for comparing the one object with the another object. So basically it will compare the memory address. Okay, but you can have your own implementation as as it is done for the other methods. Here we have given an example of the sample implementation, how equals object can be implemented. But there is another method called hash code. Now you must have heard of an equals and hash code contract. So these two methods, equals and hash code, plays a very vital role in when it comes to storing some element into the hash map or any of these particular collections, right? So this is hash code is nothing but it is going to return some integer value which will calculate based on the key or the value which we are trying to create or store, right, in the collection hash map or hash set. So in this also you can have your own logic to be written, right, to maintain the consistency, right. Make sure you implement the correct so that it is not there is no hash collision happening. There is a get class method which is going to return the class object associated with an object basically. So it will contain metadata about the objects, right. That is the get class method. Now there is one clone method which is going to return the copy of an object. This must be implementing the clonable interface for allowing to clone, or else it will throw a clone not supported exception. Okay, that is mandatory, right. Now there is a finalized method. This is used for the garbage collection, and if you want to destroy an object, so this is the way how we write it. So although this method is depreciated in the latest version of Java, but yeah, this used to be one of the way where we can actually garbage collect. There is a notify method which basically going to wake up a single thread that has been waiting for an object monitor purpose, right. So uh, this is used in the context of an multi-threading environment where one thread acquires a lock and then it is going to wait for another thread to release the lock. Notify all. So wake up all the threads which are waiting for that particular on that particular objects to monitor, right. That is one method. Wait. Now this is going to cause the current thread to wait until the another thread is going to invoke either notify or notify all, right. So these are used in the context of the multi-threading environment. Now there is another version for wait which has got a timeout. So it will wait for a specific t period of time and automatically it will end up, right. So it will automatically wake up. So these are the fundamental methods, and make sure you know all these particular methods. And basically most of them are overridden, which you can depend on your own implementation. Now what is dynamic polymorphism? If you go to the concept of like runtime polymorphism, it is nothing but an ability of a method to behave differently based on the object that is called up, right. So even though the method signature remains the same, right. So this occurs during the runtime, not the compile time. That's the reason it is called dynamic polymorphism, or it is called runtime polymorphism. Now there is a if you go with this, there is another name that is called as a method overriding. So it is achieved using the method overriding feature. So where you have a parent class and then you have a subclass where you provide your own implementation of that particular method which is already there in the parent class. Okay. Late binding. So basically this method is going to invoke its method at the runtime based on the actual object whatever it is of type, right, not the reference type. Okay, so now if you see animal is there, and then there is a dog who is going to extend the animal, and there is another cat is going to extend. Now if you see here, there are three objects that are created. One is animal, one is dog, and one is cat. Now if you see based on the object type, right, whatever it is going to invoke it, right. So the very first is going to invoke the animal sound. The second is going to invoke the based on the dog, and then it is going to be the cat. So although The benefit of using the dynamic polymorphism is that it will allow you to use the object of different type very interchangeably. So as long as they are, have a common superclass of your interface, right? It gives you the flexibility, and also it gives you a maintainability. You can change the superclass method, you can propagate the subclass and make it easier to maintain your code and extend it and write your own implementation. Now, what is class loader? Basically, this is one of the important and the core concepts when it comes to the core basics of Java, right? So it is part of the JRE environment, and that is responsible for loading the classes which are there in the JVM at a runtime. So this plays a very important role, as I mentioned, which is going to dynamically link the process. It will ensure that a class is loaded properly, and then whenever it is required, it is there, right? That's it makes ensures that. Now, class loading basically it's a dot. When you compile a class, it will have a dot class file, right? So it will be loaded into the memory, and then memory it is going to be executed by the JVM. Now, the hierarchy basically it is going to be a hierarchical for the class loader that will work together to the loader classes. Most commonly those are all like one is bootstrap class loader, one is extension class loader, and one is the system class loader. So in the bootstrap, what exactly it is that it will load the core classes, basically the classes which are there in the lang package, the string, object, etc., which are part of the rt.jar or any other, right? That it will be loaded from there. Now, when it comes to extension, it will be loaded from there is an extension directory, which is JRE lib extension, which contain the extension libraries for Java. Now, the system library, basically this will be loading from the class path. You have some certain class path defined, so which will include some specific libraries or maybe user defined classes which we have written by own, that will be loaded up at the end. Now, as we already discussed, that there are different types of class loader. One is bootstrap, extension, and the system class loader. Apart from that, you can create your own custom class by extending the class loader class. So this could be very useful, like you wanted to load certain classes from the remote location or from a non-standard location of Java, right? You can create your own custom file. Now, some of the classes can be loaded lazily whenever there so in order to save the memory, right? So whenever it is required, only those time it is required, so it will improve the performance as well. Now, when a class is requested, right, to JVM, what it does, it will check if it is already present in the not. If it is not present in the memory, right, it will go to the class specific class loader and it will load that. Now, and a class visibility. So a class visibility, basically it is going to load by one. It is not going to visible to other classes, right? Unless you are explicitly specifically leading to a potential class loading isolation. So example, the web application is so they might have its own class loader, but yeah, it will not be one class loader at the very specific level. It will not be going to visible to the other level, but yeah, vice versa, from the top to bottom it can be visible to all of them, but from bottom to top it will not be visible at their own level, right? So if you see at the example, the class loader, there is a dot class and then we have a get class loader, right? Now if you see, there is under the try block we have written that load class, right? And we're going to load the array list class. Okay, so this is going to there is a method, as I said, get loader class. This is used to get the class loader that is going to load the class loader example class, right? So it will dynamically load the array list class. Now, the process of loading the class is that it will first find the class loader to find that particular base class by its name. Now, once it is if it is founding that particular class, it is going to load into the memory and it is converting that particular bytecode into the runtime environment representation basically. And then it is going to, the class it is loaded, it is going to be verified, prepared, and then it is going to be initialized. And then after in the initialized processing, the static, whatever the class is in the class, whatever the static block or the variables are initialized, it will be initialized in it. When it comes to a parent-child relationship, right, class loader behave in the hierarchical way. So the parent class loader is going to delegate the class loading to its child loader class. So it will be having a kind of a chain of responsibility. Let's say system class loader, which is going to delegate the loading of class to the extension class loader, which will again delegate to the bootstrap class loader. So it behaves in the delegation model. So if one class loader is unable to load any of this class, it is going to delegate to the top class parent class loader, and this ensures that it goes to the top level. And if it is not going to find any of this particular exception, the class, then it is going to throw an exception. Now, this is a kind of a tricky question, I would say, and also kind to test like if you know the concept of an abstract class. So, can an abstract class have an constructor? So yes, definitely you can have an abstract class which is having a constructor. Although like you cannot create an instance of it, but you can definitely create a constructor which is going to initialize the state of the class when the instance of a subclass is created for it, right? Even though you cannot directly, as I mentioned, instantiate the best class, but this constructor can be called from the subclass, which is going to be like super dot. Then you can call that, right? I given an example of animal, and then there is a dog is going to extend it. And if you see the constructor of the dog, you will see a super class, super method called up. Now, what are the marker interfaces, and why do we use them? Now, when it terms called of an marker interface, right? It's an interface which has got no methods and basically no fields. Now, this basically is used to mark a certain class with some specific property or certain behavior, signaling to the compiler, basically the JVM, that this has certain behavior and it should be treated in a special characteristic, right? So it will have no methods, it will does not define any method, so it is purely a marker or a indicative class, right? So the signaling purpose, basically it is going to the classes which is going to implement this particular marker interface, it should be treated in some special way by the JVM, right? Or at the runtime. So basically if you go with serializable, right, clonable, right, security related thing, you in those cases, if you need to achieve certain functionality or treat differently, we can extend implement those. Now, let's take an example of serializable. If you see, this is a serializable interface, which is a marker interface. Now, it is going the class which is going to implement this particular interface is capable of being serialized only. If you are not going to implement this particular interface, then it is not going to persist in the database or any file, right? So it is not. Then only it will be allowed to return to certain string, basically, right? Now, cloning related, now there is another example of a marker interface which has got implement the clonable interface, which will indicate that class can be cloned using any of the clone method. Now, why do we at least require this particular interface? Now, let's say you want to have some behavioral indication or identification, basically. So that will allow the certain developers to tag certain classes that they will indicate that they should be treated a little bit different from the normal classes, or it should have some special behavior, right? In that case, we can use that. Also, it will have a separation of concern, so it will help you separate the concern by decoupling the behavior from the actual implementation. Now you have a flexibility to you can check at the runtime whether that particular class is going to implement a particular marker interface, and you can take certain action accordingly, right? Like using the instance of etc. So here is an example which we have given. If it is of type serializable marker interface, then we do certain things, right? You can indicate and then you can do certain actions on it. Now what is final class keyword? Now this particular keyword can be used in terms of applying to variables, methods, and also to a class, but it ensures that when it is marked as an final, right, it cannot be modified or based on the context wherever it is used, right? So let's say if it is applicable for variable, so once the variable has assigned certain value, right, you cannot change that particular value, it becomes a constant, right? So if you see the max is equal to value, it is 100, right? Now second, if you see, there is a final method which is we are going to override we have that particular method written, and if you doesn't want that particular method to be overridden by the subclass, right, in that case you will mark that particular thing as an final. Whenever the child class is going to extend that particular and then implement that particular method, it will cause a compile time error. Now when in terms of applying to the fire classes, right, you will be restricted to extend that particular class and have your own implementation. So it will fail at the compile time, so that it is not going to allow you to extend it. Now what is the purpose of a transient keyword? Now basically this is used to indicate certain fields which should not be serialized. So when you're in the process of serialization and deserialization, when you want certain fields to be skipped up during the serialization process, you can mark it as a transient. So whatever the fields which are there, which is marked as a transient, will be ignored and it will not be saved in the stream. So serialization in the process, it is process of converting an object into a byte stream. So typically it will either save into a file or send it over to the network. Now marking, as I mentioned, marking it as a field will tell the JVM to skip this particular field during the serialization process. Now let's say you have some certain passwords, or say let's say you have some certain temporary data which will not be required, or that there is a quite important thing which you doesn't want to be saved and to be hacked up. In that case you mark it as an transient, right? If you see here, there is an example. Now if you see, the salary is marked as an transient. So if you see here, when you're trying to create a serialized version and then you're going to deserialize it, right, the name will be preserved, but if you see to the salary, right, it will not be preserved, it will be zero, right? This is how we can mark it as a transient. Now what is comparator? Now if you are aware, like there are two things, one is comparator and comparable. Now when it comes to comparator, it is an interface which is going to define your own custom ordering logic for an object, how it should be ordered, right? So that is not particularly natural order, but if you want them to be a custom sorted order, right, then you can use that. So it is part of the Java util package, and it provide a way to compare to basically the two objects, right? And when you're trying to compare, right, there is a compare method inside it, and then you're going to basically deals with the two objects, one is object 1 and object 2. So based on the negative, positive, or zero, right, it can indicate that whichever object is greater than the another one. So uh, where we exactly use this is, like, let's say when you are sorting some of the collections, let's say list, set, or any of this particular array, and you wanted to use it, so certain custom logic, right, we can use that particular thing. Now here I've given an example over here, which is going to which I have an person, and then if you see, we have implemented an age comparator. If you see, and then we are going to implement our own compare method, right? Now if you see, if you want that particular things to be sorted based on the age comparator, we can actually collection dot sort, and then we have that particular pass that particular list, and then we can have this particular class which is going to implement the comparator, right, and we can add it. Now while printing, it will be printed based on the age actually. Now, what are enum types? Basically, if you if you exactly go with the elaboration, it is an enumeration. So this is kind of a special class which is going to represent certain group of an constants basically, which are not changeable basically, and it is one of the important and the powerful features which was introduced in Java 5. So let's say, and when you want to define certain collections which are fixed predefined values and which will be usually used as a constant, right? So these are the it is called as an enum type basically. So it is fixed set of constant. So it can be have enum fields like methods and also the constructor like a regular class, right? It can have all these particular things. Basically for the type safety we use this, so ensure that it has got only one and only one valid constant which is can be used in the code. Now if you want to define certain enum, how do you define, right? You can enum, and then you can define that particular name, and then you can define your constant basically. And from there actually, if you can in any of this particular implementation, you can use it directly, call it with the dot, and then that particular constant, right? This is how you use it. Now, when it comes to using the enums with certain methods and fields, right? You can have and also have certain fields, methods, and the constructor, right? So here, if you see enum, then there is certain Sunday. If you see that is called true, right? Monday, if it is false, right? In this way, we can actually define those. And if you see, there is a constructor defined here, right? Which is going to pass the boolean over here, and if you see here. Uh, the benefit of using the enum is that it is one of the type safety. Now it ensure that you don't accidentally assign certain values mistakenly. There is a quite readability, so you'll be able to see that, and you'll understand, and it is going to have a quite meaningful constant value, right? You can add certain you can add certain fields, methods, and constructor to the enum, so that it is making it powerful as is similar to the class, right? Now there are built-in methods which comes with it, so with something called as value of an ordinals, right? I hope the concept got the concept of the enum. Now what is out of memory? So this is basically a runtime error which will occur at the when the JVM is unable to allocate any object due to the lack of memory, right, or availability of the memory. So this basically arises when there is when a heap space or a permanent space is exhausted. Basically, it will have no space to allocate memory. So there are two types of out of memory. One is space. One is heap space, which will occur when JVM cannot allocate any memory in the heap space to the object. And there is also a meta space or a permanent space when JVM will not allow able to allocate the class meta any memory for the class metadata, right? Basically, which is a meta space, which is a new version related concept. Now, what are the common causes of it? It can be some memory leaks, or let's say you have certain large data structure, or you're making use of an extensive thread creation process, or let's say you have an inadequate heap size configuration, which was defaultly configured, right? Now, how do you identify or debug that particular out of memory? What you can do is that you can increase this particular heap size, so which was insufficient, by maximizing it. And then how do you do that is that Java, then you can xmx2g, or like Java, when you're running your application, right? This will allocate some memory to it. Now how to check for that particular memory leaks? What you can do is that when your objects are being referenced, but which are not no longer used up, right? You can detect using the certain tools like profiling tools like visual m profiler, jprofiler basically, or eclipse memory analyzer. So this will allow you to inspect your memory and finds out an object which are not being garbage collected, or identify certain objects which are using the excessive memory basically. Okay, so the common signs of memory leaks in this particular application usage, uh, s- uh, which can be released up basically. We can make use of the garbage collection logs. Now these are basically used for reclaiming the memory location from the objects but which are no longer in use. Now to analyze certain garbage collection behavior, you need to enable the GC logging by certain arguments which has to be passed in the JVM, right? So if you see here in this particular thing, you will be able to see that we have certain parameter passed when you are trying to run it, right? Analyze now thread dump. Now if you see, if your application is throwing certain out of memory exception, whether it is due to the excessive thread usage, you can use thread dump to check the number of threads being active, and then that extracts ties. So this can be done using the sequoid signal, that is either in the Unix or the Linux, or we can actually make use of the JStack to generate the thread dump basically. Okay, so the JStack and then process ID and then the thread txt dump. Now heap dump for deep analysis. Now what, when out of memory occurs, right? You can generate certain heap dump by adding following flag into the JVM, right? Which will, we can, because after the error whatever it happens, right, you can analyze that particular dump tool using certain MAT, that is Eclipse MAT, or you can use your kit actually to find the object which are consuming more memory. Now how do you optimize the memory usage, right? So you can avoid unnecessary object creation which are, or you can avoid unnecessary object pooling. You can limit the size of the collections basically, right, like list, map and queues, by not growing it unboundedly, right? We can make a use of the primitive wherever it is possible, right, instead of the wrapper classes, so which will consume little bit less memory. Now the profile and the test in the production environment, right? Basically if you are able to run your application in any of this particular staging environment that will mirror the production environment, this might help you to identify the memory leakages or the issues which are occurring in the production, right? That will help. Now imagine, let's say you wanted to, you're having a Java web application that processes the large file uploaded by the user. Now, and if that particular out of memory occur after the file is processed, right, is processing, so it might indicate that the application is loading the entire file into the memory, and then it is trying to process it, right? So instead of making it to a smaller chunk, it is going to load that particular memory at once, right? So the approach how it should be is that we can switch to certain streaming approach, like handling the file into the smaller chunk, and then instead of loading it into memory at once, we can increase certain heap size memory according to the application, right? We can make use of certain Eclipse memory mat, or to inspect certain heap dump and look for the large objects which are causing memory leaks. Now when it comes to Java interview process, right, you will definitely have some certain Java 8 coding interview questions, right, which will depend on the intermediate or ternary operations, and certain logics which can be certain behavior which can be written in logic, right? So which is by making use of the Java 8, right? The very first program is like, can you find the sum of the list of the integers using the Java 8? Now the list will be provided, array list. You wanted that particular list to provide the list, sum of the list. Now if you go to the intermediate operation, that is map to int, right, it is going to convert that particular thing to an integer, and then it is going to provide a sum of it. Basically this is how you achieve it using the Java 8. Now if you see here, what is the second question is about, it wanted to find the first three elements from the list. Now you have in the array list there are n number of elements, but if you wanted to find only the, or you only showcase only the three elements, in that case you will use a limit method, which is an intermediate method, and then you can use a for loop for it. Now what is the purpose of this particular @Spring Boot application? Now this is one of the core important annotation which is used for the Spring Boot, and it is where the application gets started basically. So it is very key part of the application. So it basically combines several annotation to simplify the configuration and certain setup of the application. So typically it is used at the very main class of that particular Spring Boot application, which will enable certain features to make the application run smoothly, right? So the role basically, if you see, it is basically the combination of the multiple annotation. So if you have heard, it is a combination of the three annotation, that is at the rate configuration, at the rate enable auto configuration, and at the rate component scan. Now, when it comes to at the rate configuration, the classes which are marked as a configuration class, it will indicate that it can contain certain bean definition that a Spring IOC container can manage basically. Now, when it comes to enable auto configuration, right? So it will enable the auto configuration in a Spring Boot, which means that it will automatically configure certain your application based on the dependency in which it is mentioned in the class path. For example, if you have some database dependencies, right, the Spring Boot automatically will configure all the data source for you. Now, component scan, basically, if you are will tell this scan certain current packages, right, and also sub packages for the component, right? Like if you define at the red component, at the red service, at the red repository, etc., right? So this will discover those particular bean, and actually it will be managed by the Spring container. Now, when you're bootstrapping your Spring Boot application, and when this particular class is the main class basically, right? It will tell the Spring Boot to run the application, configure everything which is automatically whichever it is there, and you have to start up the embedded server basically like Tomcat and Jetty, right? That's how you can bootstrap your application. Now, when it comes to a Spring Boot application, right, it will simplifies your configuration. You doesn't, I mean, without this particular at the rate Spring Boot, you need to basically manual everything, configure everything on your own. Like you have to define your own annotations, you have to define your own configuration, you have to define your own component scan, right? So making it more verbose and harder to maintain, right? So by making use of this at the rate Spring Boot, it will give you a smooth start, and then also it will combine all this particular about three annotation. It will make your application run, set up, and maintain easy, right? So that's how this particular at the rate annotation is used. Now, now why do we basically use this particular? It will make your application setup simple and then minimalistic by reducing certain manual configuration which will need to done. So basically it will boost your setup automatically. You can focus on writing your own logic inside the classes, right? This That's how the it will ease up your process. Now, when you compare Spring Boot with Spring framework, right? So Spring Boot is definitely built on top of Spring framework only, but it is basically quite easy, simplifies or easy for the development of a Spring Boot Spring based application. Basically, it provides set of default configuration, default tools to create a standalone application, and it will allow you to create a production grade application with minimum setup, right? So it will reduce your complexity, it will reduce your boilerplate code involved in certain setup of your application. So the key important factors are that automatically is going to configure all your component based on the dependencies which are defined in the class path. You have certain embedded servers by default like Tomcat and Jetty, right? You doesn't need to configure it explicitly. Very minimal setup is required, so it will reduce your XML configuration or extensive use of these annotations. You can create your production ready application with like the features like health checkup, metrics, and then monitoring certain Spring with the help of the Spring Boot actuator. Now, when you compare the Spring Boot with Spring Framework, right, with configuration, it is quite require in the Spring Framework. It will require quite extensive configuration like XML, and you can set up certain components and dependencies. But in come to Spring Boot, right, it will provide auto configuration, and also it will sensibly define the default things, right, which will reduce your manual configuration. Now, web server setup, basically Spring Framework, you have to externally define the web server setup like Tomcat and Jetty. but in Spring Boot it has got embedded inside it. Now, when you're trying to reinitialize your application, right? Spring frameworks require you to set up and integrate certain for complete registration for the application, right? But Spring Boot, it will provide an easier and a minimal setup using the configuration Spring Boot application basically. Now, when it comes to deployment, right? You have to typically create your own WAR file and then you have to deploy it on the certain external servlet, right? Container basically. But you can actually with Spring Boot, right, you can actually package it. It will be a self executable jar which can be run in the embedded server. Okay, that's it, the difference. Now at the rate controller and the rest controller, basically these are basically an stereotype and also the used in context of the REST API, right? So what happens is that it will be able to handle a certain HTTP request and it will be able to send the responses and what kind of data it is going to return basically. Now, when it first thing actually when we talk about at the rate controller, now what is the when we use Spring MVC, right? It will mark that particular class as a controller, so it will indicate that this is a controller, and it will handle certain web request. Like let's say the view of this particular web application is typically going to be certain JSP or timely, right? So in that case, we are going to use that. Now, when you're trying to handle your responses, right, this method is going to is class animated with at the rate controller. Typically, we will return certain views, basically the string name, which will return the view template name, right? And it is going to resolve that particular view resolver, which is going to render on certain view. Now return type, whatever the method at the rate controller can return certain model view object, or it can simply return a string name which is going to point to the view, right? So that's how we can actually define those. Now if you define here, if you see at the rate request mapping, and if you see it is marked as an at the rate controller, so if you see model attribute is defined and then you are returning the hello view over here. Now, when it comes to controller, REST controller, if you see, this is one of the specialized version of the at the rate controller only, but it is including the at the rate response body. So it is used in the context to handle the response RESTful web services basically. So it is part of the Spring Web built for building the API. Basically, it's a convenient and you're defining the annotation with a combination of at the rate controller and also plus the at the rate response body. So it doesn't need to explicitly define this particular both annotations. So it will be taken care in one single annotation, that is at the rate controller. Now, when you are trying to handle the response, right? This particular whenever it is marked as an at the rate response as controller, it will automatically serialize it into the HTTP response body. So typically, this is a kind of JSON or an extent depending on that kind of request, basically. So the return type, it can be kind of an object like string, object, map, custom object, and typically it can be converted into certain suitable formats like JSON or etc. Right? So similar way we can define it. Now, how do you manage the dependencies in Spring Boot? Basically, dependencies when you're typically it will be managed by using the Mavens, or let's say if you're using Gradle, right, which are one of the popular tool for automation tools, right? So, if you go with the Maven, right, you define that in the pom.xml the dependencies, and then you will include the dependencies like what kind of starter dependencies you require, right, for the common or the used libraries you require, right? So that's how you define. Gradle is used basically when you are not using Maven. So the people who are convenient to use, you can use Gradle. But yeah, in the Spring Boot starter, basically these are all pre-refined set of libraries or set which will include everything which you need for a specific functionalities like web application development, or like data persistent, etc. So depending on the starter dependency and the libraries you require, you can define a starter dependency, starter uh, version management. Basically, this is used for the dependency management plugin, which will handle certain version conflicts which are there. It will ensure that there is a compatibility of the versions of the libraries. So the versions of the Spring Boot itself will have the parent POM, which will have from the which is transitive dependency, right? So it is going to be taken care by the Spring Boot plugin or POM, the parent POM. from the Maven. Now, what is at the rate transactional? Basically, how do you use it in the Spring Data? Now, if you have heard of the transaction, it is used in the context of Spring, where you have to manage certain transaction in your application, right? So it will ensure that the series of database operations which are getting executed as a single unit of work, right? It ensures that it is going to be executed in a single unit of work. So basically, if there is certain failure, right? So all the changes which are already made by this will be rolled back, and then it will there is a consistency in the data and integrity also. So when it comes to atomicity, right, all the operation which is performed inside this particular transaction will either be committed or either it will be rolled back. There will be no half committed things. So propagation, so it will control the behavior when the method is called inside the another method. So basically the transaction things which will be joining the other existing transaction, or you want to create a new transaction, it will decide the based on the propagation level you define. Now isolation level, it will define the level of visibility the particular transaction has to the other transaction. Let's say you have some read or uncommitted or a read committed, right? So in that case it will have some isolation properties defined, so it will have the visibility of the particular transaction. Now, what is the rollback rules, right? So, like can specify certain specific rollback features by default, right? If there is certain exception is happening. Now, how transactional at the rate transactional work in the Spring Boot is that now when you annotate with the at the rate annotation, right, transactional, right, it is used to, let's say, is used in the service layer to wrap certain business logic method that will interact with certain databases basically. So you can have certain read only transaction. So if a transaction is read only, it will only fetch the data. You can set it as an either read only is equal to true, and it will quite improve your performance by only hinting that the database will only be used for reading purpose and not for updating purpose. Right, the default behavior it is that it will, if certain exception is occurring, let's say runtime exception, it will automatically roll back. So you can have certain custom behavior which you can handle certain specific exception in a specific way. Okay, now if you see in this particular class, you have this particular at the rate transaction defined on the update entity, and if you see there is certain exception happening, right, it will roll back. So now if you see here there is a read only on a transaction we have written. So if you see read only is equal to true, which will only be used for certain reading purpose only. Um, Now what are the usage I would say when you want a certain specific rollback on specific certain exception. Let's just say SQL exception has occurred, right? So you can actually throw rollback exception for this and an SQL exception, right? So the propagation is happening by default wherever you are using the propagation, let's say required. So if there is an existing transaction, it will participate in it. Otherwise, a new transaction will be started for it. Now, what is the difference between the CRUD repository and the JPA repository? Basically, this is used in the context of the JPA, right? So the difference between these two is like it will have their different functionality which they provide by working in the Spring Boot database, right? So the CRUD repository, basically it will have the basic operations like create, update, delete, and operations. You have save method, you have find by method, you have find all method, you have delete method. So this is a lightweight interface. Basically, this is used for the same certain basic operations, right? But when it comes to JPA, right, you have some certain extendable functionalities apart from whatever it is there in the CRUD repository, and it will have some specific functionalities like find all, pageable, that is flush, save and flush, delete and in batch each get one, right? So it is more powerful when it is compared to the CRUD repository when you're dealing with the JPA, right? Let's say when you're using some pagination functionality, or so you're using some batch processing, right? That's where you make use of it. Now you can, how you can customize your queries in a Spring Boot Spring Data JPA using at the rate query. Now you must have heard of JPQL, but there is also a way where you can define at the rate query. So you can define your own custom query using at the rate annotation, which will define. or in a native SQL queries. Basically, this will allow you to have a certain custom queries without worrying about the full implementation. Now, JPQL, when you are writing in the form of JPQL, which is an object-oriented way of writing, it will work with the entity name and the attribute instead of the table name or the column, right? So when it comes with native, the query is written in the SQL, which will directly hit the database table name with the column name, right? So when you're dealing with the custom JPQL queries, you can define in the similar way that the rate query, and then you can define in terms of that particular using the entities and instead of the table name and the variable name. Now, when you're dealing with the custom native queries, you can define the actual with the help of the directly tables and this one, right? So you can define those. So when you're defining with the pagination, you can define here. There is certain at the red param which you can bind it with the at the red parameter to certain query. Now, what are microservices and how do you differ from the monolith? Basically, microservices is an architecture type basically where you are building your application as a collection of a small loosely coupled and independent deployable services basically, or the applications, right? So each services is responsible for certain specific implementation or business functionality which will communicate with the other services to in order to have a complete set of functionality achieved. Now, when it compared with the monolith architecture, right? So it is an entire application in one certain application. It is built in a single entity. It is tightly integrated into a single unit, and also all the business logic, all the database interaction, all the services are part of the single large code base, right? So the difference when it comes to the microservices and the monolith, the size and the structure is quite different. So in microservices, there are all small and independent, but monolith it is single and very large database code base, right? Deployment, when it comes to deploying the microservices, each services can be deployed separately and independently, but monolith you have to deploy it as a single unit. Now, scale, when in terms of scalability, microservices can be scaled independently. Each service can be scaled independently. Now, in monolith, we have no chance. We have to explicitly, the whole application has to be scaled up together as a whole. Development. Now, when you're doing certain development, you can decentralize. You can have certain team working on a certain different services, and then you can use different technologies. But when it comes to monolith, you will have no provision. You have one central development, one team working on it, and then you will be using the single technology stack basically. Now, in terms of isolation or a failure isolation, microservices, one services fail will not bring down the entire system, right? So it will have some fallback mechanism, right? But in terms of monolith, the entire system can go down. Now, when it comes to inter-service communication between the microservices or service-to-service communication, right? You can handle it in two ways. One is using the synchronized way, and one is using the asynchronous communication. So basically, so HTTP request when you are making use of RESTful web services, typically using the JSON, right? Using the payload, or you can use GPRC, which is again a high performance RPC framework, which is using the HTTP2 for communication and as a prototype for the serialization process. But uh, that is how one way. The second way is actually asynchronous, that is an event driven, which we can make use of RabbitMQ, Kafka, right? So microservice will what will do is it publish certain events to certain messages, which will allow you to make your application decouple and also reliable, so that the service A will what will do is just send certain messages to the certain Kafka topic, and the other microservices or service B will listen to that particular topic and it consume and then act accordingly. Now, how do you implement the rate limiting in the microservices? So basically, the rate limiting is nothing but it is going to be controlling the number of requests which is requested by the client, and to which a service can serve the request in a specific period of time, preventing an abusive use of that particular services. So it will not make it overload. How do you make use of it is that in API gateway you can actually have the implementation. So if you see the API gateway like Spring Cloud Gateway or Kong, you can actually define or enforce certain rate limiting capability at the very entry point basically. So it will control the request through using the based on the certain IPs or an API key. So you can limit each users to certain number of 100 requests per minute or some basic restriction. You can have some certain bucket token based bucket or like leafy bucket algorithm defined. So rate limiting algorithms such as like these two things can which will control the flow of the request based on certain predefined limits, right? So let's say a service issue as a certain token, right, that represents certain number of allowed requests. When the token times runs out, right, the requests are throttled basically. Now Redis base there is one of the base limits. So we are using the Redis to store certain request count, right, per user based IP. A service checks the Redis cache before it is going to process that particular request. Now Redis will going to track the number of requests in a given window time. So this will track that. So this is way how we can implement the rate limiting using the API gateway rate limiting algorithm and also distributed caching like Redis. Now, how do you handle the data consistency in the microservices? Eventually, it is crucial when it comes to data consistency and when you're dealing with the distributed architecture, right? Um, um, so eventually, the eventual consistency, basically, even in the event-driven architecture, microservices which are communicating asynchronously via events, right, such as Kafka or Rabbit, right. Now, changes in one system or a service are propagated to the other services through certain events, basically. So it will ensure that there is a consistency. Uh, Eventually, not very immediately, but it will definitely at a certain point it will have. Now CQRS command, basically this is one way of separating your read operation, the write operation model to basically to optimize for the scalability and the performance improvise. So based it is used in the event driven architecture system. Now two-phase commit, this is basically a distributed transaction where you strictly in this case what you're going to restrict certain consistencies needed. When a strict consistency is needed, right, you can use this particular distributed transaction to PC, which will involve all the services has to either commit or roll back changes together. So this is there is a drawback because it is quite complex, it is slow, and also it is prone to certain blocking certain any services until it has been completed. Now there is another alternative which is saga design pattern, which is used in two ways. One is using the choreograph way and one is using the orchestration way. So instead of using the distributed transaction approach, the algorithm will break that particular transaction into certain smaller steps, which will be handled by certain either services or a central coordinator. So each services perform its own part and then communicate with each other, either using the event or the API. If any of this particular fails, then there is a compensating action or a rollback things has to be triggered up. Okay. The idempotency, if you see, it ensures that their operations are all idempotent. So no matter like often by using the unique transaction ID for the request, ensuring that there is a safe retries happening. Now, how do you secure your microservices? Basically, when you are securing your microservices, right, it will involve certain levels of security to protect your data, your services, like your APIs, right? So here are the some important points. So authentication and authorization, these are two. Like if you see OAuth 2 and then JW2, we can make use of OAuth 2 for securing your authorization purpose and JW2 token for token based authentication, basically across the services. Now Spring Security, it is gotten features of authentication authorization. It can provide integrate with the Spring based microservices. Now at the API gateway level, you can have this particular central security implemented using the API gateway using which will handle the authentication authorization. Also you can implement the rate limiting at certain at the entry point itself, so it will reduce the burden on that particular individual microservices. Now if you have heard of TLS and SSL encryption, basically it's an encryption type which is it will ensure that your HTTP is quite secure when it is communicating between within the services, and it will protecting the data in the whenever it is in the transit mode. Now, when it comes to service authentication, we can make use of this MTLS, that is mutual TLS, or we can make use of certain API tokens for securing the service to service communication. So it will only ensure that only authorized services are going to communicate or interact. Now, access control. There are certain role-based access control which can be implemented using some much more granular access control within the services, which will limit certain user access based on the role it has and on the permission it is given. Now, based on the input-based validation, we can actually have this particular prevention injection attack by validating and then also sanitizing all the user input requests across the microservices. So you can validate it. Now we can also implement the using the logging and monitoring, centralized logging and monitoring. We can use a VLK text tag, or you can use Prometheus to monitor certain activities or to try to detect any unauthorized access or potential security threats. Now, how do you manage transaction across the multiple services? Now, what happens is that we already discussed there is a saga design pattern. So when you're dealing with multiple services and you're trying to maintain the data consistent, it is quite challenging because it is decentralized in nature, right? So there are two approaches. One is two-phase commit, and one is saga design pattern. But two-phase commit is more a traditional way, and it is not recommended to manage this distributed transaction, basically which will involve a coordinator and the participant, but it will either it has to be rolled back as an all, or it has to roll back, or it has to commit, but it's quite blocking and it is not suggestible. But when it comes to saga design pattern, uh, so it works on the principle of eventual consistency, which will basically means that at the very immediately the data consistency may not be achieved, but eventually or gradually it is going to achieve it, right? So this pattern is going to use where the transaction is broken into certain smaller or a series of local transactions. Now each series of this will involve certain transaction to perform in their own local transactions, and it is going to publish certain events, right? So which is going to notify another services to continue their work. Now in between, let's say there is certain failure is happening. Now this will trigger a compensating transaction which will roll back the services. It will roll back that whatever transaction it has happened, it will inform the other services. Now in saga there are two ways. One is using the choreography based and one is using the orchestration based. Now choreography is basically a services which is going to publish certain events to notify the other, and each service is how and each services knows how to act and then react to the certain events. But basically when it comes to orchestration, basically it is one of the central service which will act as a coordinator, and then it will invoke the each services and then ensure that at a certain steps and the certain sequence, certain things are executed in a certain correct order. Now, what is the difference between the delete, truncate, and drop? This is asked in context of the SQL questions. So basically, when it comes to delete, you can remove certain specific rows. You can roll back also, and also you can perform some operation at the row level. So it is quite slower because it has to go for the logically identifying that particular row of the deletion. Right? So that's where how you do it. But in terms of truncate, it will remove all the row from the table, but the structure will remain the same. It is faster as compared to the delete, right? Because it will not try to find certain single logical identification of that particular row. But the problem is that in delete you can roll back, but in truncate you cannot roll back. In drop, now when it comes to drop the completely, you will remove the table from the structure and everything from the rows and the structure from the database itself. So it will be it will completely remove it permanently. You cannot roll back also. So once it is removed, it is gone. So all the associated table structure, indexes, constructor, trigger will be removed. So that's how the difference is. Now, what is the difference between clustered index and non-clustered index? Now, indexes are basically used to improve your performance when you're trying to retrieve something, right? Now, let's say when it comes to clustered, right? Now the data in the table, that is which is physically sorted, or it is stored according to the order of that particular clustered index, right? The table can only have one clustered index basically, because the data can only be sorted in one natural order, right? So the data index itself will be stored in the table. The data row are stored in the index order. So the performance, the faster, it will improve the performance for the range of certain queries, but it will also slow down your insert, update, and delete operation, because it has to reorder certain structure, right? Now, non-cluster index, basically this is an index which is going to be stored separately from the actual database table, right? It will have certain references pointing to the actual rows. The table can have multiple non-cluster index. Like a similar in cluster, it is only one which you can have, but in non-cluster you can have multiple of them. Now it has got their own storage separate and actual database table, right? Data table for it. Now when it comes to performance wise, right, it is faster in terms of specific queries, but it is later inefficient in terms of range queries as compared to the cluster index, right? This is how the difference is. So what are the different types of joins? When you wanted to get data from certain table to different tables, or right, so you can make use of this particular joins. The inner join is basically is going to return only those rows which are there matching in this board table. Left join is going to return all the row from the left table and also match rows from the right table. And if it is not matched in, then it will return null value from the column from the right table. Similarly, the vice versa for the right join. Now full join, it will return all the rows which are matching in either left table or right table. If it is not matching, that will return not that will run for the missing side. The cross join is basically is going to Cartesian product of both the table, meaning every row of the first table is combined with the every row from the second table. So it's a Cartesian, it's a multiplication that's we used. I hope this video was able to shed some light on what kind of interview questions are asked in the real interview questions, and this video was helpful for you in preparing your interview, whether you are going for a Tech Mahindra or whether you are going for any interview, right? You're preparing for yourself. If this video was helpful, please don't forget to like, subscribe, and hit the bell icon, and please forward it to the necessary people who are going to prepare, or you're in terms of preparing their interview.